Nazi gold. Two words that conjure up so many images, right? Like
Hmm.
stolen fortunes hidden away, and that lingering sense of injustice. It's a topic that always seems to be in the news or in a movie or a book.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like one of those historical mysteries that just never really goes away, does it?
No, it doesn't. And today we're going to kind of take a deep dive into this whole Nazi gold story. I've got a ton of listener questions about it, and we've got some really fascinating sources for this episode. They really lay out the whole journey of this stolen wealth, how it was acquired, how it was hidden, and what ultimately happened to it. But we're not going to get bogged down in like every tiny detail, right?
Right.
We're going to try to keep it moving. So our goal is to try to trace those key movements, uncover some of the surprising facts, and ultimately just try to understand like the core of this whole historical puzzle. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's the best approach. I mean, the material you've sent over is amazing. It really gives us a solid narrative to follow. We can start from, the early days before the war even began and see how this accumulation of wealth, really started even then. And then we can follow it through the war years and all those dramatic discoveries at the end of the war, and even right up to today with all the mysteries and controversies that still surround it. It's a story of greed and brutality, a really dark chapter of history.
For sure. So let's start at the beginning then. Like you were saying, the Nazi regime's lust for wealth. It wasn't just something that popped up during the war. It was a deliberate strategy from the get-go, even during peacetime.
That's absolutely right. Even before the war, the Nazis were super aggressive in consolidating their economic power. And a really key figure in all of this was a guy named Walther Funk. He held two very powerful positions. He was the Minister of Economics and also the President of the Reichsbank. Talk about influence.
Wow.
Yeah,
He had his hands in everything, it seems.
he really did.
Yeah.
So he's the guy driving the rapid rearmament program right. And this is where it gets really disturbing because our sources point out that he also oversaw the processing of gold and other valuables stolen from victims of the concentration camps, like Buchenwald.
Hmm.
We're talking about gold rings and jewelry and even dental gold. All of this stuff was being melted down and literally banked by the Reichsbank. It's just horrific.
It's hard to even fathom that. And it wasn't just about internal exploitation, right? Like, Germany's economy was in a really precarious position in the years leading up to 1939.
You're absolutely right. By 1939, Germany had already defaulted on all their international loans. The reserves of foreign currency were practically non-existent, and this was largely because their entire economic focus was on this massive military buildup. So they were basically forced to rely on bartering goods for trade, which isn't really a sustainable long-term strategy, is it?
No, not at all. So how did they manage to actually increase their official gold reserves during this time? It seems kind of counterintuitive.
Well, they did it through a systematic campaign of looting assets. They were annexing or occupying territories like Austria and Czechoslovakia and the area around Danzig, which was under Nazi control. They just went in and took whatever they could. Our sources estimate that they managed to grab something like $71 million in gold reserves just between 1937 and 1939.
71 million. That's a huge sum of money, especially back then.
It is. And get this, the Reichsbank seems to have been deliberately understating its official gold holdings. The figures they were publishing were much lower than what the Bank of England estimated they actually had. We're talking about a difference of around $40 million in 1939.
So they were trying to hide it.
Seems that way. Maybe they didn't want to draw too much attention to what they were doing.
Makes sense. So even before the war started, this whole systematic acquisition of wealth was already in full swing. Once the war actually began, the scale of the looting must have just exploded.
Oh, absolutely. It went into overdrive. Once the war started, the expropriation of assets continued and intensified dramatically. It's estimated that they plundered around $550 million in gold just from the governments of the countries they occupied. To put that in perspective, we're talking about something like $223 million from Belgium alone and another $193 million from the Netherlands. These are just staggering sums.
It's hard to even wrap your head around those numbers, and our sources emphasize that those figures only account for the gold that was stolen from national treasuries, right? It doesn't include all the personal fortunes and business assets that were plundered from individuals and companies all across occupied Europe.
Yeah, you're exactly right. We're talking about countless private collections, artwork, jewelry businesses, bank accounts. All of it was just seized. The real total is probably impossible to calculate.
Yeah, it boggles the mind. It's just unfathomable the amount of wealth they stole.
Yeah.
But there's also this kind of ironic twist to it, all right? Because while they were amassing this incredible fortune, weren't they also shooting themselves in the foot economically?
Yeah, you're right. By draining the gold and foreign exchange reserves of all these countries they conquered, Germany was actually making it harder for themselves to get the materials and resources they needed to keep their war machine running. They needed to trade for raw materials and things like that. And by stealing all the gold, they were making it much harder to do that. It's almost like their greed backfired on them in a way.
It's a fascinating paradox for sure. So let's jump ahead now to those final months of the war, the chaos and the collapse of the Nazi regime. This is where we get to that incredible discovery at the Merkers salt mine. It's a story that sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does.
Yeah.
So the U.S. Third Army is pushing forward right. They're advancing through Germany, and they enter this region called Thuringia, which was actually slated to become part of the Soviet zone after the war. On April 4th, 1945, they occupy this small town called Merkers. And just 2 days later, something really remarkable happens.
Yeah.
2 American military policemen, they encounter these 2 French women who are displaced persons. They're looking for medical help.
And this chance encounter ends up leading to this huge discovery.
It does. One of the MPs, a guy named Richard C. Moots, he happened to speak German. So he starts talking to these women. And as they're walking back towards the town, they pass by the entrance to the Kaiserroda salt mine. And these women, they tell Moots that the Germans have been stashing huge amounts of gold and other valuables inside this mine.
It's like something out of an Indiana Jones movie.
Right. But at first, when Moots tries to report this information, nobody really believes him.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
It thinks just a rumor.
Yeah.
Wartime craziness.
Yeah.
But Moots, he insists that it's true. And eventually, word starts to spread up the chain of command. It finally reaches Lieutenant Colonel William A. Russell. And Russell, he realizes that this could be a really big deal. So he starts investigating, he talks to other displaced persons, and he even finds a British prisoner of war who had been forced to work in the mine unloading all this treasure. They even find an assistant director from the National Gallery in Berlin who had been put in charge of overseeing the storage of priceless artwork that was being hidden in the mine.
Wow, so they're starting to realize that this is not just some wild story.
Exactly. So by Sunday, they've got enough evidence to justify a full-blown investigation.
Yeah.
And they bring in engineers, and they blast through a wall into this massive vault inside the mine.
And what do they find?
It's unbelievable. The vault is just overflowing with wealth. There are thousands of bags and cartons filled with German currency and foreign currencies. There are thousands of gold bars and boxes of gold bullion, thousands of bags packed with gold coins. They find bags of silver and platinum and even stacks filled with gold rings.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, those rings were almost certainly taken from victims of the concentration camps. It's just heartbreaking. And then there are hundreds of bags and containers filled with all sorts of Nazi loot, artwork, tapestries, furniture, silver, priceless treasures from all over Europe. The scale of it is just mind-boggling.
I bet. So they find all this incredible treasure hidden in a salt mine. What happens next?
Well, this is where a guy named Colonel Bernard D. Bernstein enters the story. He's a really interesting character. He was the deputy chief of the financial branch at HF, that's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force.
So he was a pretty important guy.
Oh, yeah, he was a big deal. And he actually reads about the discovery in the Stars and Stripes newspaper.
Really? Just like anybody else?
That's how he found out. But he immediately recognizes the significance of it. So he jumps on a plane and flies to General Patton's Third Army headquarters. He's got direct orders from Eisenhower himself. His mission is to confirm the contents of the find and then figure out how to get all that treasure out of there safely.
And they needed to move it quickly, right? Because
Yeah.
Merkers was going to be in the Soviet zone.
Exactly. The Allied powers had already agreed that that whole area would be under Soviet control after the war. So Bernstein and his team, they know they have to find a safe place to store all that treasure somewhere within the HF zone. They end up choosing the Reichsbank building in Frankfurt. It's the most secure location they can find.
Makes sense. So the Merkers discovery, that's a big part of the Nazi gold story. But our sources also talk about how vast amounts of this looted gold were actually being funneled into neutral countries during the war.
Oh, yeah. That's a really important part of this whole thing. As the war was going on and the tide started to turn against Germany, they needed more and more money to finance their war effort. So they started using neutral countries, especially Switzerland, to help them out. They were transferring gold that they had stolen from occupied countries and from individuals to the Swiss National Bank. Basically, they were laundering this stolen gold.
So Switzerland was knowingly helping them out.
Well, it's a bit complicated. There's a lot of debate about how much the Swiss knew about the origins of this gold, but there's no doubt that a lot of it ended up in Switzerland. A Swiss historical commission called the Bergier Commission, they did a huge study, and they estimated that the Swiss National Bank received something like $440 million in gold from the Nazis. And they believe that a significant portion of that, something like $316 million, was probably looted gold.
So the Swiss were profiting from Nazi crimes.
It appears so. And what's even more damning is that the Bergier Commission found evidence that the governing board of the Swiss National Bank, they knew pretty early on that a lot of this gold was coming from occupied countries. They knew it was stolen, but they kept taking it.
Wow. And Switzerland wasn't the only neutral country involved, was it?
No, not at all. The U.S. State Department did their own study after the war, and they found that Germany had transferred over $300 million in gold to other neutral countries like Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and Turkey. And again, a lot of this was facilitated through the Swiss National Bank. So even though these countries were officially neutral, they were still engaging in trade with Germany and indirectly helping them to finance their war effort.
It's all pretty murky, isn't it? The lines between neutrality and complicity seem pretty blurred.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very gray area.
So we've got all this stolen gold ending up in neutral countries. What happened to it after the war? Did the Allies manage to recover it all?
Well, some of it was recovered, but not nearly all of it. Of the $240 million in gold that went to these neutral countries, excluding Switzerland, the Allies only managed to get back about $18.5 million, so a very small percentage. Sweden actually did the right thing and returned almost $15 million of that. But the U.S. took this stance that countries were only obligated to return looted gold if they had bought it directly from the Reichsbank, which meant that some countries were able to keep gold that they had received as collateral for private loans they had given to countries like Spain.
So basically, they found loopholes to keep the gold.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And all of this brings us to the biggest mystery surrounding Nazi gold. The gold that just vanished. It disappeared into the labyrinth of the European banking system.
Right. And this is where all the conspiracy theories come in. There have been countless books and documentaries and even a lawsuit against the Vatican Bank trying to track down this missing gold.
Yeah, it's a real rabbit hole. And the Vatican's name comes up a lot. There was this intelligence report from 1946 called the Bigelow Report that claimed that the Vatican had taken possession of something like 350 million Swiss francs in Nazi gold for safekeeping in 1945. The report said that about 150 million of that was seized by British authorities at the border between Austria and Switzerland, but the rest of it supposedly ended up in secret Vatican bank accounts in Switzerland.
That's a pretty serious allegation.
Yeah. It is. And there were other intelligence reports for around the same time that seemed to back up these claims. They said that over 200 million Swiss francs, mostly in gold coins, were transferred to the Vatican with the help of some members of the clergy.
And what does the Vatican say about all of this?
They completely deny it. They say there's no truth to any of it. They claim that the Bigelow Report is based on false information. So you've got these conflicting accounts. On the one hand, you've got these intelligence reports, and on the other hand, you've got the Vatican's denials. Who knows what to believe?
It's a real historical puzzle.
It is. And speaking of mysteries, there's also the case of Portugal. Portugal is actually the second largest recipient of Nazi gold after Switzerland. And there's evidence that a lot of this gold might still be hidden away somewhere in Portugal.
How did Portugal get involved in all of this?
Well, Portugal was neutral during the war, and they were a major supplier of tungsten to Germany. Tungsten was this really important material that was used to make weapons. At first, the Nazis were paying for the tungsten with regular currency, but then the Central Bank of Portugal discovered that a lot of this currency was counterfeit. So the Portuguese leader, Salazar, he insisted that from then on, all payments had to be made in gold. So the Nazis started sending huge amounts of gold to Portugal to pay for the tungsten.
Wow. So Portugal got rich off of Nazi gold.
That's one way to put it. And there's even evidence that some of this gold might have passed through a train station in the Pyrenees Mountains. Historians have found documents at the Canfranc International Railway Station on the border between France and Spain that indicate that 78 tons of material labeled as Nazi gold was transported through that station.
That's crazy. So basically we're talking about vast quantities of stolen gold that ended up scattered all over Europe.
That's right. And a lot of it is still missing. Estimates suggest that something like 91 tons of Nazi gold was laundered through Swiss banks alone. But at the end of the war, only about 3.6 tons of that gold was recovered. The rest of it just vanished.
It's a pretty sobering thought. All that wealth stolen from innocent people, and then it just disappears into the banking system. It's a story of greed and corruption on a massive scale. But it's also a story of resilience and the ongoing fight for justice.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. We
Yep.
can't forget the victims, the people who are robbed of their possessions, their livelihoods, and their lives. This whole saga of Nazi gold, it's a reminder of the terrible cost of war and the enduring legacy of injustice.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a lot of questions to think about, doesn't it?
It does. Questions about accountability and responsibility. Like what happens when neutral countries get entangled in these kinds of transactions? What obligations do they have to return stolen assets? And what about the institutions like banks that facilitated the laundering of this gold? Should they be held accountable too?
These are tough questions, and they're still relevant today. We're still dealing with the legacy of Nazi gold and the ongoing efforts to track it down and return it to its rightful owners.
That's right. This isn't just ancient history. It's a story that continues to unfold. And it raises some really important ethical and legal questions that we're still grappling with today.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Nazi gold, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. Considering the vast scale of the looting and the relatively small amount of gold that was ever recovered, what does this tell us about the challenges of tracing and reclaiming assets after large-scale conflict? What role do international institutions play, and what responsibilities do neutral parties bear when they're confronted with these kinds of situations? It's a lot to think about, and it's a reminder that the pursuit of justice is never truly over.
Well said.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. Until next
It
time.
was my pleasure.